Hello, everyone. Today, I want to discuss minimizing the generational ripples by using a no-wake zone approach. Um, this is a process that requires an idle speed. This is a process that requires patience that can be trying, hurtful, um, very difficult for the person who is managing the approach. And I greatly advise people to have a mental health provider leading them through this process. I greatly advise people to discuss with your primary care provider the mental strain and the stress that you will go through psychologically throughout any situation. But I also advise that professional help to be given to all parties involved during any form of parental alienation or any process of family members being alienated or separated from other family members. This is a process that you will coach yourself through, and hopefully you have a strong support system. Hopefully you have mental health care providers that are holding your hand and encouraging you and leading you through the way. And I'm going to share a little bit of insight on my own history with my mother and with the hurt that I dealt with, and realizing and recognizing my daughter's actions toward me today, and seeing and understanding that her reactions are a mechanism for her to protect herself because of the trauma that she has endured, the alienation that has broken bonds, and as well as her age during that separation, that it was an overnight separation from me and her home front, her sibling, and everyone in her life that she knew close to her. She was given a hand that was similar to what I was dealt during my childhood. Being able to recognize that also gives me my own motivation to help people realize that this type of occurrence does happen more often than realized. And there are approaches and there are ways to help yourself and to help minimize the generational impact that will happen through alienation of parents, children, family members. This type of an event does carry generational ripples, and they are seen, they are felt not just from the parent, the child, people that were separated, but they are felt from the family members that knew them, that were there for them as a child, is there throughout their birth, and uncles, cousins, the sibling bonds that are broken and that will never be the extent of what they were, but do have the ability to be rebuilt as long as there is an approach that is done strategically, but also with using self-awareness of the actions, the communication that happens between people, and also being able to communicate with the people of your family who are left behind, not having contact with the person who has been alienated, the child or the person who's been alienated. Bonding together in a positive manner that is encouraging. You don't want to lash out your anger and your hurt toward the other party, toward the people that are present, and that are in the person's life, the child's life. You want to make sure that you recognize the most important goal, and that is to minimize the generational ripples. So my mother has not been a part of my life, a steady part of my life, since I was 4 months old. So with that separation my father created when I was 4 months old, he took me. Now this was 1981, 1982. And this effect that happened, it broke the bond between me and my siblings. I grew up raised as an only child. Being raised as an only child, but I was insightful, and I also was raised knowing that I had a mom. I was raised knowing that I had siblings, but I still had the only child household that I was raised in. So there was a complexity there that I navigated even as a child, because I longed to have a mom. I longed to have a mom. And I say a mom because I was told negative stuff about my mother. And the negative stuff I was told about my mother is that it was very contradicting, in a manner that I was told my mom wasn't able to be a mom because she wasn't raised in a household that taught her how to be a mom. So being raised with that immediately spiked superstition about my family that I knew nothing about. I was brought in the middle even of racial tensions between my Native American mom and my Irish white father. And those tensions being raised under, I absorbed, I processed on my own. I was very insightful about the fact that as a child, the racial tensions that I grew up with in my household never made sense to me. Racism never made sense to me as a child. When you're raised in a home that as a child you don't think it makes sense, and you're already questioning that as a child, that gives you a little bit of a step up to process the other information that you're raised and that you're taught. So I was told stories. I knew that there was no custody papers, and I knew that as a child, I knew this, which was quite surprising if you really think about it. My father was very open about a lot of stuff, but very skewed in his own biased opinions. My emotions toward wanting my mom went back and forth between I wanted my mom, but I wanted a mom. And my father's own inability to have healthy relationships in his life prevented him from moving forward. And those short-term relationships that he had when I was a child were also confirmations to me growing up that there were negative influences that made my home front not have a mother and a father on both ends. I quickly at a young age had decided it wasn't just my mom, it was my dad as well. Knowing that and being raised in that household made me not avoid reaching out to my mom when I got older, but I was under a lot of trauma on my own. I grew up traveling across the nation my whole childhood. Very traumatic. My father struggled with alcoholism. He also came from a very violent childhood, which rippled onto my home front. My home front wasn't always loving roses with the loving, supportive father, especially when alcoholism was involved. There was a lot of anger, a lot of aggression, a lot of breakdowns emotionally that I grew up with. So that put me on a survival mode. And growing up in a survival mode, reaching out to my mom could not be a priority. What I do with my daughter is I use the no wake zone approach. I go at idle speed because the trauma that I feel and that I still have from my own mother not being in my life is what I know my daughter is going through. Now, what I also recognize is that she does have memories, and she has 7 years of a strong, loving bond with me as her mother. That in itself could be more traumatic than me not knowing my mom because I was only 4 months old. So my upbringing was conditioned more. My bond was more solidified to my dad, and I adjusted to my home front. What my daughter dealt with was being pulled from her home front at the age of 7. And at the age of 7, I can't imagine what her trauma and the depth of her hurt must have been like. But I do know that she heard negativity from me, from her father, from her stepmom. There is very much in her father's home front a feeding off of people's negativity of other people. There was always an enemy. There was always a bad guy. There was always something negative to be spoken about someone. And unfortunately, I was that person that was the bad guy for her father and for her stepmom. They bonded very closely because I was the bad guy. I was the bad guy to my daughter's father for leaving. Me leaving made me the bad guy. The pretense of me leaving is something I hold great pride in. I have great pride today for leaving that home front and for leaving the toxicity, for leaving the unstable home front that me and her father had, and for the fact that I did my best to get him help for what created our unstable household. But make no mistake, I loved her father dearly. She was created out of pure love and happiness and joy that we had together. But when I left, I was the bad guy. And when I was the bad guy, that was something that her stepmom, who came in right after me, they were together a matter of a few days after I left. And they were married 6 months after I left. So I don't know the extent. I don't know how long they really knew each other. But what I do know is their bond was very tight because I was the bad guy. I grew up during those years. I was younger. I was in my mid-20s during this time frame. And during that time frame, I was very naive, which her father brought me into a whole new realization of what the world was, what people were, how big time money and small towns worked. And that was a reality that hurt, but it was a reality I was navigating even during the young years of her life. So I accepted being the bad guy. And that bond is what created a household for her to walk into. And she was taken during a court battle at 7. And she walked into that home front where I was the bad guy. And that in itself is going to make it hard and harder for her to come back to me, because the words that were spoken, the stuff that was talked about, it's going to create a division, because psychologically that's her dad. That is her mom. And when I have spoken to my daughter, it's hard for me to hear her say mom, because she's not talking about me. She's talking about her stepmom. Knowing that is something I have to approach at idle speed. I have to process my own hurt, but I also have to resort back to my own experiences with my mom. When I first reached out to my mom, on my own, I was probably 20 or 21. And I remember the phone conversation where I reached out and I got the phone number. My father got the phone number, and he was very much a part of it because he was a very controlling individual. And his own trauma is why he was so controlling. But at the same time, my mom and my dad had their own unsettled issues. So even though I was the one reaching out to my mom and my dad spoke. My mom and my dad were in the middle of me trying to talk to my mom and talk to my other siblings that I didn't know. That ended one day when my little brother got on the phone, and him and my dad started yelling and cussing at each other. And that ended my attempts to reach out to my mom anymore, because it was too hard for me to process. Keep in mind, I was still under a survival mode, learning my way in the world. It wasn't just about me reconnecting with my mom. I was still learning what it was like to be a 21-year-old young woman trying to figure out what I wanted in life on my own. So connecting with my mom is something I could not process anymore. And I stopped reaching out to her until after I went through the death of my father. I was unable to reconnect at all and reach out to my mom anymore until after my father's death. I was 27 when he passed away on a farm accident with a tractor. It was that awakening that made me realize my father had isolated me in a community and in a location that my only blood relative was him. His family was estranged from each other from generational trauma. They never processed it. They never spoke about it. And when they did try to reconnect, it would normally blow up in an argument and in a huge fight, normally over the phone. And there would be years and years of no contact in his family. There were times that when my grandfather was alive, we lived with him, we lived around him. My grandfather owned 2 or 3 separate properties as I was a child growing up, and we normally lived on one of those properties. But there were blow-ups between my father and my grandfather, and it wasn't uncommon for me to know about them and for there to be a huge, long separation because of that. That learning pattern is what I carried on when I was dealing with my mother. I wasn't taught how to communicate and how to approach a situation calmly and consistently. The lack of consistency and the approach of alienation is generationally taught through my father's side. Knowing that is something I had to process when my father passed away, because I now was facing a world where my home front with my daughter's father was unstable. I was dealing with his addictions that he had no control over. I was dealing with lies being told each and every day of my life. My attempts to love him through his struggles was breaking me. And all I wanted to do was run away, because that was what I was taught growing up. When there was a conflict, you left. You just didn't deal with it. You moved on with your life. Those are the patterns that I recognized I followed after my father passed away. Those are the generational ripples that I now see in my daughter. The conversation that I last had with my daughter back in October, it hurt her. It took her to a depth that she heard a truth about the situation that she had never heard. She heard the reality that what she had grown up all of those years thinking was what happened was not what was being spoken from my mouth. And I did not approach her in a manner that was, I wasn't going to go with the flow. And the reason being is I know how important honesty is from my own trauma. I never had honesty given to me on the foundation of why my mom wasn't with me, why I only grew up with my dad. Knowing that when I became a grown woman and I started navigating child custody with my children's fathers and attorneys and states, and being a Native American child, half Native American child, being raised with a white father in the United States, those are the realities I had to learn on my own. And most of those I learned after my father passed away. So I never got to settle those conversations with him. I never got to have him admit he was wrong for completely alienating me from my family, from my mom, from my Native American culture, from my community that was less than 20 minutes away from the town I was born in. I did not know growing up as a small child that I had aunts and uncles and cousins 20 minutes from the home I grew up. As a young adult and as a young mother, realizing that and learning that is something I had to process, but I also had to tell myself during this situation, circling back to that reality and how I felt as a young woman, learning that was not how I wanted my own daughter to learn about the realities of her parental alienation from me. So handing her the truth, no matter how hard it was to speak it, and giving her the legal facts that should have protected her and prevented her alienation from all of us is something she needed to hear. So in my 9 years of living back where I was born, very close to where I was born anyway, I have dealt with attempting to reconnect with my own mom, learning who my mom is, recognizing the trauma that she has dealt with and how she dealt with it, because I now get to see how not to handle my own hurt from my daughter's rejection of me processing her parental alienation. So I live in the same town as my mom, and my town might have 1,000 people, probably closer to 700. Very tiny little town. My mom lives on the other side of town. I have seen her a handful of times, and most of the time she pretends not to see me, even though she did see me. And I have watched her and my little brother completely walk away and turn their back, even though I am at the same grocery store with my 2 youngest children. That is a hurt that I process to this day. It's generational ripples that have happened that I now know I have to approach at idle speed when dealing with my own daughter. My mother, I can justify by saying, hardened herself. When trauma is too hard, people will preserve their self psychologically by hardening their emotions. You stop crying, you stop feeling, you harden yourself. And those are what I protect my own emotions from. I don't allow myself not to cry. I make sure I cry. I went many years of my life without crying. And I will never forget when I finally cried again, how great that felt. I live in a tiny town where everyone knows everyone and everyone recognizes everyone. And I had to learn from my local postal carrier that they had no idea that was my mom, because she was telling them while she was walking, because she doesn't drive, she's never drove. She was walking to the post office in snowy blizzard conditions to check the mail. And they were sympathetic toward her and knew she was a tribal elder and was like, well, you must have someone that, can pick this up for you or help you. And she informed him that all she had was her son, who lived here. At that time, she had 3 children that lived here, and she had several nephew and nieces or grandchildren, my nephew and nieces, that lived in this very town. But she alienated herself again and her own inability to process healing. And all she latched onto was my little brother, because they self-medicate themselves in coping mechanisms from their trauma. They are trauma bonded, and they feed off of their own hurt and their stories and their inability to realize how loved they are by so many people. I was checking out at the grocery store, and I looked over, and there is this short lady in a red sweatshirt at the ATM in the front of the store as I'm at the checkout line. And it's my mom again at the store. And I look at her and I hope that she looks my way, but she had already positioned her body in a manner that told me she had already seen me. And she was attempting not to be seen by me or to have me call her out. And I kept an eye on her. But I also told the checkout lady, oh, there's my mom. And she just looked shocked at me. And I was like, I think she's hiding from me. Approaching these situations with honesty is important, especially when growing up in a small area, especially when dealing with people that are going to interact with both parties. You want to hold credibility for who you are and for the situation. You want people to know what your approach is. And I let my checkout lady know that it's my mom. I'm like, she's hiding from me. And I looked at her, and I might not have said the best thing, but I told the checkout lady that in our relationship, I'm the mom. And I said, I'm here if she ever needs me, and that's all I can do. And she looked so shocked, but at the same time, she goes, that's so beautiful. And I just smiled. And as I kept my eye on her, I watched her fastly walk out the door, making sure not to turn her body, because I'm talking to people, and I know she hears me. I know that she knows me. She knows my voice. We are standing within 10, 15 feet of each other. So as my mom rushes out the door, I have to coach myself through that situation and remind myself that if she ever needs me, she knows where to find me, the same way that I do with my daughter. People that are hurt and broken will not act in a healthy manner. And you can't make them. You can't get them help if they don't want it or if they're not ready to. I also inform myself that if they never want my help in that relationship, I have done everything I can for my other 3 children and for my other family members and for my other future generations to not be hurt as severely as what I was growing up and as severely as what my daughter has been by being alienated from us as well, and the hurt my mom endured from being alienated from me. I recognize the hurt. I recognize the pull away, but I also recognize that being slow and using a no-wake zone will help those generational ripples not to affect the future generation. I use honesty and transparency toward my other children. My 2 youngest, I don't discuss the matter. I just let them know, yes, you have a yaya, you have a mom, you have a grandma that lives here in Plummer, and she's just busy. She has stuff she's doing. And as they get older, I will approach it differently. But for now, I keep it as vague as I can because they're young and I don't want them to feel rejection that my older nephew and nieces feel from her. That is a hurt that my other siblings feel rejected from my mom's inability and unprocessed trauma. So recognizing the hurt that I brought to my mom by not reaching out to her, and by when I did reach out to her, not continuing to reach out. I rejected my mom through the argument of my dad and my sibling, and I completely rejected my mom and hurt her again when I reached out to her. So breaking that generational ripple of trauma is an approach that I work hard for. I coach myself through it, but I also use compassion through the actions that I have given to me from my daughter, the rejection that I'm given, and the rejection that I still have from my own mother. So those are the approaches that will help. It's not easy. I do have wonderful healthcare providers, mental health care coaches, and I myself have education and psychology. So that helps me through it. And I hope that everyone remembers to reach out and be kind to yourself, be gentle to yourself. And as you're navigating this, remember that taking your time and going at idle speed can sometimes be the hardest, but the best approach for future generations to come. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye-bye.